We Aren't One Yet. Advocacy Project by Sally Roberts. Some people have a goal of making the world a united place, of making the concept of oneness a reality. The problem is, there are systematic and cultural issues in place that prevent this idea from moving forward. And an example of this is racism. Racism is a form of discrimination that differs from prejudice because it involves power. In order for one group to be a victim of racism, their oppressors must have a higher power, often in socioeconomic terms, over them. It's a global problem that doesn't necessarily have a global solution. The solution comes at an individual level, realizing that no matter where we are, who we are, what we're doing, we have an impact on the lives of those around us, and hopefully leaving a positive impact that looks beyond the narrow lens that racism instills in countries and areas and cities and people all over the world. In Canada, the area of Winnipeg is said to represent friendly Manitoba, but in fall of 2014, many events took place that shows that it has some serious ethnic and racial issues. Nancy MacDonald, a writer for Maclean's national section of the publication, compiled a list of a few of these occurrences in one of her articles, Welcome to Winnipeg, where Canada's racism problem is at its worst. Brian Sinclair, an Aboriginal 45-year-old man who died from a treatable infection after being ignored for 34 hours in a city emergency room. Renelle Harper, a 16-year-old Indigenous girl left dead by the Assiniboine River after a violent sexual assault. Tina Fontaine, a 15-year-old child from the Sakajik First Nation, was wrapped in plastic and tossed into the Red River after being sexually exploited in the city. Fortunately, Indigenous activists believe Tina Fontaine's death also marked a turning point in racial relations. That, perhaps for the first time in history, Winnipeg and all of these issues are not being dismissed as an Aboriginal problem. Ironically, from the fall's horrific events, a sense of unity has begun to emerge. Even Thelma Favell, who raised Tina, believes that her niece did not die in vain. Meaningful change will not come easily, but all this holds promise, however faint, of a more hopeful future for the city, she says. Canada is just one example of places all over the world that have these racial issues, and these issues are not okay. Fortunately for them, their issues are starting to be able to see that they are race, and it's not just an Aboriginal problem, as so many Canadians used to unfortunately believe. Another example of a country with racial issues is Germany. Here in Germany, there are 620 seats in the German parliament, but only 81 candidates of foreign descent are running in the elections, and as many as only 20 of them are even thought to have a chance of being elected. Specifically, Islamophilia is becoming a larger and larger problem in the country. A Turkish Muslim woman wearing a headscarf was harassed on the street while talking on the phone in 2015. Many times, people are discriminated against in the job market simply because of their name. In one study by Germany's Konstanz University, a resume belonging to a young man named Serkan, an obvious Turkish name, and another named Tobias, a German name, with the exact same qualifications, were sent to the same companies. In the end, Serkan was rejected 25% more frequently than Tobias. SPD Deputy Chair Ayhan Olgus, a senior politician of Turkish origin, says that immigrants sometimes encounter difficulty in the job market because of their names. This is yet another example of racism, although in this case, a lot of times race goes beyond just seeing the person. Hearing the name is what triggers it in Germany, and that's so severe, especially in a place that has already overcome so many issues in the past between ethics and racism. It's disappointing to hear that it's in the same spot, but hopefully today or tomorrow there will be a change in the country, a change for good, a change for better, a change that we can bring about. Although many people from all over the world know of China's sexism issues, specifically with people opting to have an abortion when they discover they're carrying a girl, it has some essential racism problems as well. The most predominant form of racism is that against African Americans or individuals simply perceived as African American. Liberian student David Johnson moved to China just 2 months ago. He said he has already been subjected to several racist remarks. One time, I was walking down the street and someone called me a stupid black C word, he reported. When he asked about it, he thought that the reason behind it was, maybe it was because I was with a Chinese girl, and they don't like that. Hatim Sa from Mumbai in India has worked in finance in China for 6 years. He recalled Beijing's visa crackdown on foreigners working or living illegally in the city around the time of the 2008 Olympics. I was set to move into a house, but when I went with the landlord to the police station to register, they told me I couldn't live there because the police didn't want brown people within the vicinity, he recalled. My white South American roommate had no problem. Although Saha believes that the situation has since improved, he still feels that if you are brown here, you are not equal. He added, they assume dark-skinned people are doing something dodgy. If there's a white person in the room, they'd rather speak to the white person. Much like in the United States with prejudice against African Americans, China has it as well. Except they not only have it against African Americans, but anyone perceived as someone with a darker skin color, even someone from an entirely different culture, just because they're too general to actually even look at the differences and see that beyond the differences of skin, there's nothing different between the stereotypical Chinese male and the African American male, or the Indian male. We're all the same deep down, and China is just another country that fails to realize that fact. "15 years ago, immigrants said that the best thing in Australia was its welcoming and hospitable people. In 2013, immigrants ranked that last out of 10 attributes, with lifestyle now topping the list. Australians are actually most likely to be prejudiced against people of Middle Eastern background. The Social Cohesion Survey found that more than 40% of people from Asian countries suffered from racism last year, 2014, within the country of Australia, with Malaysians being the most affected, followed by Indians, and third, Sri Lankans. Joy Chan, an Australian born in Malaysia but of Chinese descent, said her family moved to Australia when she was in year one. She was a 1-year-old for better opportunities. They lived in Bowral, where there was only one other Chinese family, and people assumed that Chan could not speak English. It was a huge shock to me. I had never known that I was different, she says. 30 years later, she still gets asked where she's from. It makes her doubly resentful, because the Chinese do not consider her truly Chinese either, because she was born in Malaysia. She encounters racism more on a personal rather than an institutional level. You get random people in the street calling you names like chink, fish face, all kinds of nasty stuff, she says. Australia, even though it used to be so welcoming, is yet another country around the world that has fallen victim to racism. Here, unlike in China and unlike in America, they focus on people of Middle Eastern background rather than those of African American descent, furthering the bounds of racism between the countries, but still realizing that this is a major problem that needs to be solved, not just in our backyards, but around the entire globe. Unfortunately, many countries in Africa also suffer from racism. 20 years after the death of the apartheid in South Africa, there are signs that racism is mounting a comeback, if it even went away. Several cases in comfortable middle-class suburbs, blacks have violently been attacked by white residents after falsely accusing them of being prostitutes or criminals. At least 16 such cases of racial violence have occurred recently within the Western Cape Town alone. Some people have also said that whites see themselves as victims of racial discrimination because of South Africa's policies of affirmative action and black economic empowerment. Some claim that they are victims of a white genocide because of the large number of murders of white farmers, although studies have found that the murders are mostly motivated by robbery, rather than by racial hatred. This is the white genocide that people are claiming to exist. They claim that because of all of these affirmative action issues, that whites are now getting the short end of the stick, and that blacks are starting to become the more racist group. That's because the blacks are starting to gain more power in society than the whites, and that's how come the racism has shifted so drastically in South Africa within the past 20 years. And that's also why it's changed since Nelson Mandela's time. Another country that's greatly affected by racism is Brazil. Afro-Brazilians, people who self-identify as black or brown, make up to 53% of the population, for a total of about 106 million individuals. It's the world's largest black population outside of Africa, and the second largest after Nigeria. And according to United Nations Children's Fund, black Brazilians ages 12 to 18 are almost 3 times more likely to get killed than their white counterparts. A survey by the Brazilian Forum on Public Security also found that black Brazilians accounted for 68% of homicide victims. Resistance killings are when victims shot allegedly after firing on the police without any evidence to support or deny their case, and there's no investigation afterwards. Luiz Roberto Lima, a black photographer from Rio de Janeiro, who lived on the streets as a teenager, said that regarding the resistance killings, they would kill you because you were on the street, or because you were standing up for your rights. They would also kill you for pleasure. Even if you don't have a criminal record, they would trump up something against you, just so that they would have a reasonable cause. Here in Brazil, the police are definitely taking advantage of the minority group in society, and for no reason at all. They even have a slang term for it, the resistance killings, which is how drastic that these measures have become. Unfortunately, this is just another case of racism, and we all need to come together to combat this, because not only here are people are dying all over the world because of racial tension. Speaking of unjust killings because of racism, it brings us to our final stop on this journey around the world, the United States of America. Specifically in our town of St. Louis, this past year has been a rough one. Between Michael Brown and Eric Garner, we've been front and center in the news until the recent riots in Baltimore, the tension down in Oklahoma, what's happened in Wisconsin, and the police brutality cases in New York. Here in the United States of America, the racism group is predominantly white, and the victims are predominantly African American. This has been taking place a long time over our history, since before the Civil War, when we had African Americans as our slaves, speaking as part of the white group in society. Granted, we don't have that anymore, but right after slavery came a long period of segregation. And after segregation was finally quote-unquote resolved, we had a lot of other issues follow that show that no matter how much we try to edit this racial tension between the two groups, it's really hard to get rid of it all. We know from being down here firsthand that it's not easy to solve, from the talks of the clock tower with the protesters and someone in our own class being dubbed smart umbrella man just because he was voicing his opinion about the issues in a respectful way, and he was white. We get crap all the time for being the dominant group from these people. But you know what? We deserve it at some points, because even though not all of us are racist, we are a part of the group, and if we're not being active against combating racism, we're only assisting in helping it thrive. We all need to take an active stand, and that's why it's so important, specifically here in our own hometown and sometimes college towns of St. Louis, Missouri. So there you have it, a brief snap at racism around the world. It's not a really pretty sight. Just imagine if each one of these dots on the map represented someone you know. Odds are they've all been affected by racism. Each dot represents millions and millions of people. And within that, hundreds of thousands have fallen victim to racism, not just in these countries listed, but in countries all over the world. This is why it's so important for us to take a stance against it. It's not just an issue in St. Louis, Brazil, South Africa, Australia, China, Germany, or Canada. It's an issue all over the world. By taking one small step in our town of St. Louis, or our hometowns all over the country, we can take an even bigger step and try to combating racism all over the world. So that even though we aren't one, and we haven't really grasped this concept of oneness yet, we can get a lot closer. We can truly bring justice and equality in a world where it's starting to cease to exist. And that's why we aren't one yet. That's why we will be one in the future. Because as young college students and as Micahs, we know that we can actually make a difference. And that's exactly what we're going to do.